It's just past 7:30 in the evening across India. I am Tanvi Taneja. Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll bring you the day's big stories from across India and the world. With me today from Washington, D.C. is my colleague, Caroline Malone. Hi, Caroline.
Well, good morning, Tanvi. It's 10 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. and 4 in the afternoon across Central Europe. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, we go live to Tel Aviv for the latest in the Israel-Hamas conflict. And we'll get alive on the US state election results. But first, here's Tanvi again with the headlines.
Israel readies for Gaza City push as UN decries month of Middle East crisis. Foreign nationals and the injured cross the Rafah border from Gaza into Egypt. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken meets Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida before the G7 meeting in Tokyo tomorrow. Japan says G7 support for Ukraine will not waver due to the Middle East conflict.
It's a very important moment as well for the G7 to come together in the face of this crisis and to speak as we do with one clear voice.
US voters are casting ballots today to choose governors in Kentucky and Mississippi. Polls also being held in Virginia and New Jersey. And Britain's King Charles delivers his first King's speech in more than 70 years as monarch, formally opening the UK Parliament.
My government will introduce legislation to create a smoke-free generation by restricting the sale of tobacco so that children currently aged 14 or younger can never be sold cigarettes.
So starting first from East Asia, the first day of the two-day G7 Foreign Ministers Summit has wrapped up in Tokyo with a flurry of bilateral meetings. Japan is hosting the diplomats for talks dominated by conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine, as well as addressing military assertiveness by China. On the sidelines of the G7 foreign ministers meeting, Japan and the United Kingdom released a joint statement and called for a humanitarian pause in the conflict. Japan's Foreign Minister Yoko Kamikawa reiterated the need to cooperate in securing such a pause.
Regarding the urgent situation in Israel and Palestine, we agreed to cooperate to work towards a humanitarian pause that will ensure the immediate release of hostages, the safety of civilians, and a commitment from all sides to act in accordance with international law, a calming of the current situation, and the improvement of humanitarian conditions.
The United States and Japan also held a bilateral meeting on the sidelines of the G7 meet. G7 foreign ministers are preparing a statement which will be issued following the Tokyo talks. United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that G7 foreign minister talks are an important moment for the G7 to come together in the face of the Middle East conflict.
Words of support and sympathy in the wake of the horrific attack by Hamas that did result, as you noted, in American victims as well as American hostages. And this is a very important moment as well for G7 to come together in the face of this crisis and to speak as we do with one clear voice. I look forward, as you do, to our discussions, and again, my thanks and appreciation to you personally and to Japan for bringing us together.
And for all the updates of the day one of this G7 foreign ministers meeting, DD India's Chris Gilbert reports from Tokyo.
The first day of the Foreign Minister Summit was heavily focused on bilateral one-on-one meetings, beginning with Yoko Kamikawa, Japan's foreign minister, meeting with her Canadian counterpart Melanie Joly. The two agreeing to cooperate and work together in the future, and Japan thanking Canada for its military involvement in the Indo-Pacific, such as the deployment of the HMS Vancouver to help enforce sanctions against North Korea. That was followed with a one-on-one with James Cleverly, her UK counterpart, and then a 2+2 with defence ministers involving UK Defence Minister Grant Shapps. Of course, the UK and Japan signed a landmark deal earlier in 2023, allowing them to deploy troops to each other's territories. This will be illustrated later in November with the second round of Operation Vigilant Isles. This is land-based defence exercises involving troops from the UK and Japan's Self-Defence Force here in Japan. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, paid a courtesy call to Fumio Kishida, the Prime Minister of Japan, and then had a one-on-one with Yoko Kamikawa himself before all 7 foreign ministers and the EU as well had a working dinner together in the same room for the first time, at least at this summit. Wednesday is going to be the day of major heavy lifting with 5 working sessions, including outreach to virtually to counterparts from Ukraine and Central Asia. Top of the agenda is very likely going to be how the G7 responds, how it communicates, how it navigates the ongoing conflict in the Middle East and Israel's ongoing bombing of Gaza with the rising death toll there, and concerns about any potential spillover conflicts in the region. There is business to conclude from previous summits in the year, such as reaffirming the G7's, as they've said, unwavering support for Ukraine and the ongoing conflict against Russia, and of course how these countries individually navigating their complicated diplomatic and economic relationships with Beijing, while the G7 as a whole has condemned perceived economic coercion by China and Chinese military assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific. This will likely wrap up in a joint statement when the G7 foreign ministers meeting, the second one in Japan for 2023, concludes on Wednesday. Chris Gilbert in Tokyo reporting for DD India.
Now on to West Asia. Israel's response in Gaza, sparked by the October 7 Hamas attacks, entered its second month today as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stressed that there would be no ceasefire until Hamas released all its 242 hostages. My colleague Caroline Malone is in Washington, D.C. She gives us more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Caroline, over to you.
Well, thank you, Tanvi. Thousands of civilians have crossed the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt, which reopened on Tuesday to facilitate the passage of foreign nationals and injured Palestinians. Government sources say a total of 114 foreign nationals were evacuated on Tuesday to Egypt. Well, the Rafah border crossing is the only access point which has allowed foreign nationals and critically injured civilians to depart from Gaza. The Egyptian Red Crescent aid vehicles have also reached Gaza, but fuel supplies remain restricted. Israeli defense forces have taken control of a Hamas stronghold in northern Gaza. The IDF claims anti-tank missiles, launchers, weapons and intelligence materials were found there. In the latest operations, the IDF says an Israeli fighter jet struck a terrorist hideout with Hamas weapons launching points within Gaza. The Israeli Navy, meanwhile, says it hit strategic Hamas targets, including posts with technological assets. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has again rejected calls for a ceasefire. But he has said he is ready to consider making tactical pauses in the conflict with Hamas.
The Israel-Gaza conflict appears to have no end in sight. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said no ceasefire unless Hamas releases the hostages. But Israel says it is open to pauses for aid.
Well, there will be no ceasefire, general ceasefire in Gaza without the release of our hostages. As far as tactical little pauses, an hour here, an hour there, we've had them before. I suppose we'll check the circumstances in order to enable goods, humanitarian goods to come in.
Netanyahu has also stated that once the conflict concludes, Israel will take on an indefinite security responsibility in Gaza.
I think Israel will, for an indefinite period, will have the overall security responsibility, because we've seen what happens when we don't have it.
Israel's defense minister has accused a top Hamas commander of seeking refuge in a bunker where his subordinates perished while battling Israeli forces.
Sinwar is hiding in his bunker and let his terrorist commanders die in the field. On our side, the commanders stand at the head of the force, pressing forward, achieving objectives, and leading the forces.
US President Joe Biden held a telephonic conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, discussed potential pauses. White House in a statement said that the two leaders discussed the possibility of tactical pauses with opportunities to safely depart from areas of ongoing fighting to ensure assistance is reaching civilians in need and to enable potential hostage releases. United Nations has also called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, stressing that safeguarding civilians is the top priority in this conflict.
The way forward is clear. A humanitarian ceasefire now. All parties respecting all their obligations under international humanitarian law now.
Netanyahu has clearly said Hamas is using its own civilians as human shield and said Israel is acting in self-defense while minimizing civilian casualties.
Well, US voters are casting ballots today to choose governors in Kentucky and Mississippi. Polls are also being held in Virginia and New Jersey. Well, all 40 seats in Virginia's Senate and 100 seats in the House of Delegates are up for grabs. Republicans are fighting for control of either legislative chamber in solidly Democratic New Jersey, while all seats in the General Assembly and Senate are also in play. Ohio voters will also decide on whether to add the right to abortion into the state's constitution. Well, DD India's Benji Haya joins us live from Washington, D.C. So, Benji, how important are these elections?
Look, they're key in the areas where voters are going to the polls. For instance, you mentioned Virginia, just over the river from where I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., or those votes in Kentucky and Mississippi to decide their next governors. This is about local representation on a state level to decide issues for people in those respective states. But it could also very much set a tone and a picture nationwide as we enter 2024 in a month or so time. The reason being is that whether to be a red wave, a series of Republican Party victories, for example, that could embolden and boost that party, giving hopes perhaps that they might be able to take the two chambers of Congress behind me, or even the White House where you're standing this morning, Caroline, given the fact, of course, that we saw in past days Joe Biden, the current president, trailing in the polls to rival Donald Trump. It may also give an indication for both sets of parties as to what sort of issues they might be able to win on, or which are meaning that they are hemorrhaging voters to the other side.
And so, Benji, what are the issues that are at the heart of this election?
Well, in each individual state, there's obviously going to be local situations and local circumstances that sway voters. But fundamentally, I think you can look at a couple of those states that we're keeping an eye on Tuesday and say that abortion is the big standout issue. It's been more than a year since the Supreme Court in the nation's capital revoked the nationwide constitutional right to an abortion. You mentioned just a moment ago that Ohio voters will decide whether to amend the state constitution to protect access in that state to abortion services. And in Virginia, where Glenn Youngkin is hoping to stay on as governor, that is also a key point as to whether his policy of no abortions after 15 weeks will stay. He's not on the ballot himself, but the votes are for the General Assembly, and he is, of course, a member of the Republican Party, and the Republicans could take both chambers in that House, both chambers as well. A dominant Republican performance in the polls in that state of Virginia could have major implications for Mr. Youngkin too. Put issues aside, let's take the grander picture here. Donald Trump is the front runner for the presidential nominee for the Republican Party in 2024. But if Glenn Youngkin looks and sees the Republicans doing very, very well in his local state of Virginia, that could provide some momentum for him to potentially take on Mr. Trump in that race for the Oval Office.
Well, thank you, Benji. That was Benji live in Washington, D.C. Well, in other news, Republicans in the House say they do not expect to move forward this week on a stopgap funding measure to keep federal agencies open. Funding for the government and operations is due to expire on November 17th, unless Congress agrees on a temporary spending measure that President Joe Biden can sign into law before the deadline. In September of this year, the US Congress passed a 45-day stopgap funding bill to keep federal agencies open and avert a government shutdown. Well, we can go back now to one of our top stories and go live to Tel Aviv, where Sarah Coates is standing by. Sarah, we've been hearing about the latest in aid operations in Gaza, but first tell me, it's a day of mourning in Israel. How are people feeling now, a month after that Hamas attack?
A real sense of anger here on the ground. At the same time, this is simply due to the fact that we need to remember there are around 242 hostages still being kept inside the Gaza Strip. There's been no contact with these people, despite numerous efforts from the International Red Cross to reach them. Now, people, families, loved ones of these hostages have been sitting outside the Knesset, that is the Israeli parliament, and also outside the headquarters of the Israel Defense Forces, which is here in Tel Aviv, for weeks now, demanding that the Israeli government do more to bring these people back. And look, their fear is that this ground operation into Gaza City will end up instead targeting the loved ones instead of hitting these Hamas operatives, which the Israeli military says wants to target. Now, right now, we know that the Netanyahu government has ordered these potential pauses, very short pauses, to let more aid in and potentially to facilitate ways to get these hostages out. But we're yet to see these temporary pauses actually happening on the ground. So look, it's 1 month on, as you mentioned, from these horrendous October 7 attacks which happened down in southern Israel, and people are still extremely sad. There was a 1-minute silence today, and people are just really, Caroline, trying to come to grips with what they say is the darkest day in Israel's history.
Well, that was Sarah Coates live in Tel Aviv. Well, moving on, as the conflict between Russia and Ukraine continues, Kyiv on Monday launched a criminal investigation into the 19 soldiers of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade who were killed last week in a Russian air attack. President Volodymyr Zelensky has sent condolences to the families of the soldiers.
This is a tragedy that could have avoided. The Minister of Defense, Umerov, reported to me about what measures have been undertaken to clarify all the circumstances of what has happened. The main thing is to establish the complete truth about what happened and what prevents such incidents happening again.
Well, Zelensky has also firmly dismissed the idea of holding an election in the country during the war, calling it irresponsible.
And finally, the waves of any political divisive things must stop. We have to decide that now is the time for defense, the time for a battle on which the fate of the state and people depends, and not the time for the throws that only Russia expects from Ukraine. I believe that elections are not appropriate at this time, and if it is necessary to put an end to a particular political dispute and continue to work only in unity, the state has structures that are capable of putting an end to it, giving society all the necessary answers, so that there is no room for conflicts and someone else's game against Ukraine.
Over 1,000 workers at an Amazon warehouse in central England went on strike on Tuesday over a pay dispute. The workers plan to continue their strikes on Wednesday and Thursday, as well as on November 24th, which is Black Friday, a key date in Amazon's shopping calendar. The latest strike comes at the end of a year marked by broader industrial unrest in the UK as workers seek higher wages to deal with higher inflation. Well, that's it from me here in Washington. Back to you, Tanvi, in the studio.
Thank you, Caroline. Caroline Malone joining us from our Washington bureau. You're watching DD India Global. Still to come on the show. Heavy snowfall and blizzards hit North China, disrupting transport and telecommunications, prompting all-out rescue work.
A platform for the developing world, amplifying the voice of the global south with a focus on the growing economies, resolving the conflicts, showcasing the culture, tradition, heritage and diversity. Watch Voice of the Global South at these times on DD India.
India that invents. India that innovates. India that excites. India that invites. Land of possibility. Teeming with opportunities. Watch India Ideas each Thursday, 8 p.m. only on DD India.
Welcome back. You're watching DD India Global. I am Tanvi Taneja. India's Foreign Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar met his Malaysian counterpart Zamri Abdul Qadir in New Delhi today. Both the parties are co-chairing the 6th India-Malaysia Joint Commission meeting, which aims at taking forward the mutual enhanced strategic partnership. The Joint Commission meeting is also in tone to review the progress in defence, science and technology, culture, tourism and people-to-people ties. Both the sides are also discussing the regional and multilateral issues of mutual interest. From India's GDP growth rate to its instant payment system, India's economic rise and innovation continues to make waves around the world. We have a report.
The Indian economy is being praised by leaders from world over. IMF Executive Director hailed India's GDP growth and highlighted the positive impact.
If you look at regular, employees and salaried workers, that number has increased from 11.5 crores in 2017-18 to 13 crores. In other words, a 1.5 crore improvement, which itself in percentage terms was 13% increase.
This is not the first time India is being praised. The country was seen as one of the bright spots in the global economy.
We have a growth rate for India, which is 6.8 in 2022. Let's not forget, this is one of the bright spots in the global economy, right?
Let's also take a look at how India's growth has become the talk of the town globally. According to the S&P Global Market Intelligence, India will become the world's third largest economy by 2030, surpassing Japan. India's growth rate was also the second highest among G20 countries as per the World Bank. Top US Treasury official Jay Shambog also hailed the country's instant payment system UPI for becoming a leader in cross-border payments. India accounts for the highest number of digital transactions, accounting for nearly 46% share as per the 2022 data. In April 2023, the World Bank projected 6.3% GDP rise for India. However, the country beat expectations to grow at 7.2% in 2022 and 2023. As of February 2023, in the automobile market in India, two-wheelers and passenger cars accounted for 77% and 18% market share during the year 2021 and 2022. India aims to double its auto industry size to Rs 15 lakh crores by the end of the year 2024. There's also been an FDI inflow of $33.7 billion in the industry from April 2000 till September 2022, which is around 5.48% of the total FDI inflows in India during the same period.
And now let's take a look at other stories making news around the world. Britain's King Charles on Tuesday delivered his first speech in over 70 years, formally opening the UK Parliament with a rundown of his government's legislative plans as an election looms. Addressing the Parliament, King Charles said that his government will continue to take action to fight inflation. Heavy snow and blizzards have impacted northern and northeastern China, leading to disruptions in transport animal husbandry and telecommunication. The National Meteorological Centre has predicted further snowfall, strong winds and a temperature drop in the northeast provinces starting from Monday. Heavy rains in the wake of a storm have triggered massive floods in northern France. Authorities have issued red alerts in areas near river banks. They have also advised people to avoid travelling as several roads remained blocked amid power outages. Schools in nearly 70 flood-affected towns and villages have also been closed. A hat worn by Napoleon Bonaparte during his reign at the helm of the French Empire is expected to fetch $854,600 when it goes on sale at an auction in Paris. The black beaver felt hat in traditional bicorn shape was a trademark of the emperor, which came to symbolize Napoleon's historical character. The bicorn will go on sale on November the 19th. So that's it in this edition of DD India Global. We will be back tomorrow at 5 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Do let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. You can connect with us on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram at DD India Live. You can also find us online at ddindia.co.in. We will be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Tanvi Taneja from my entire team in New Delhi. Thanks for watching. Namaskar.